Well, my name's Anthony. I'm one of the councillors. In a minute, I'm going to ask the Mayor, Alison Reynolds, to welcome everyone. But just a brief announcement. The meeting's being recorded. That's so that if we need to refer back to it, which we will do, because this meeting will inform the Town Council's response to the local plan, and we'll be able to go back and make sure we've got everyone's comments or check what was said, then we've got a record in order to be able to do that. So that recording is now started, and Alison, I think you'd like to welcome everyone.
I would. Good evening and welcome to this public meeting regarding Regulation 18 of the local plan. Firstly, grateful thanks to Swale Borough Council's planning officers, James Freeman and Jill Peat, who I believe will answer questions on the issues that concern you, the residents of our very special and unique town. I personally know how much the community and your town councillors care about the future of this special and historic town. So my hope is that this evening's meeting will enable us perhaps to see what the future looks like and consider carefully the possible options. I am pleased to introduce, obviously, Councillor Hook, who's just been on screen. I'm very thankful for him offering to chair this meeting. So I will hand over to Councillor Hook.
Thanks ever so much, Alison, and welcome from me to everyone. I'm Anthony Hook. I'm one of the councillors on Faversham Town Council. I'm also Faversham's County Councillor. We've got two officers with us, as Alison mentioned, James Freeman and Jill Peat from the Swale Planning Department. I'll ask them to introduce themselves in a moment. The purpose of tonight's public online meeting, is to give Faversham residents a chance to ask questions of the planning officers and to make any comments, to have your say about the forthcoming plan and in general about planning and development around Faversham. I think the best thing to do is I know Jill Peat's got a presentation for us on PowerPoint. It's a series of slides. I'm going to invite her to give that presentation, and then we'll take questions at the end of that. I think that's better than having questions in the middle, because it might be that Jill will come to the point you want to ask about on the next slide or something like that. So we'll have questions after the presentation. And I think the best thing to do is there's a chat facility on my screen. There's an icon chat at the bottom of the screen. It's probably there for you to, it may be in a different place depending on how your computer or your device is set up. Just type your question in the chat box. We can do it two ways. If you'd like me to read your question for you, type it in the chat box. If you'd like to ask your question yourself or make your comment yourself, then just type you for question or something to I'd like to speak, something that indicates to me you'd like to speak, and we'll try and come round everyone. We're going to, this meeting's meant to be prioritising, and I will prioritise people who are residents of the town of Faversham. We know, of course, that our friends in villages and other parishes are rightly very interested in the local plan too, but we hope other parish councils will be organising their own events. But if time permits, I'll happily take some questions or comments from other friends too. I'm going to draw an absolute halt to things at 9 o'clock. We might not need as long as that, but I expect you'll agree that that will be a time that's sensible to call meeting to an end. And this meeting will inform the response that the town council makes to the local plan. I mean, Jill's going to explain the local plan, but I think I can say something about the town council's role by summary. The local plan is an exercise in indicating where development might happen, and that's made by Swale Borough Council. Swale has to make a local plan. There's an act of parliament that says they have to. Faversham Town Council doesn't have any direct say or control over the local plan, but we are, in this matter, if you like, spokespeople for the community. So our job is to put local people's views across. Now, with that, I will hand over to James and Jill to introduce yourselves, please.
Oh, thank you very much, Councillor Hook. My name is Jill Peat. I'm the Planning Policy Manager for Swale Borough Council.
Welcome everybody. I'm James Freeman. I'm Head of Planning at Swale Borough Council. Thank you very much.
Brilliant, thank you both. And Jill, I think you've got a presentation to show us.
I have, I believe Adrian is going to help with that. Is that what we agreed?
Yes, I believe so. Adrian, if you can put Jill's presentation up on the screen.
Thanks.
Oh God, sorry. Sorry, I'm having problems finding that one to upload again.
Shall I have a go? Shall I have a go myself?
Why didn't you, can we give control to Jill to share the screen? We have to make her host for the time. Oh, here we are. Brilliant, great. It looks like it's on its way. Fantastic.
Yes.
Yes.
Great stuff. I am disappointed though that I don't get the opportunity to say next slide, please. Never mind. Evening, everybody. James and I were really pleased to be with you this evening. And as Councillor Hook's already said, we've got a PowerPoint presentation for you. We're going to cover a little bit of background. We're going to cover why we're doing a Reg 18 consultation, what the headlines of that are for Faversham, but also in general, how you can respond, what happens next, and then time for questions. Okay, so this local plan that we're working on, it's a review, it's not a whole brand new plan. And as such, our timescales overlap with our adopted local plan bearing fruits. What does this mean? Basically, it means that for the year 2022 to 2038, our development needs are for 1,048 dwellings per year, that we need 51 hectares of employment land, and the associated infrastructure to support that development, new schools, new GPs, open space, community centres, roads and public transport and so on. Also we're going to be explaining some of the influences on the local plan. Okay. So there was a lot of support for the recent Reg 18 draft plan that we consulted on earlier this year, but that support certainly wasn't universal, and with the changes to the National Planning Policy Framework, the NPPF, which is a government document that was revised and published in July. So taking that on board along with the comments received in response to the Reg 19 plan earlier in the year and the impacts from the COVID pandemic starting to bed down, we felt that on balance, undertaking a further Reg 18 consultation gave us more flexibility to improve the draft plan. Now the NPPF tells us that strategic sites should have a longer term vision. This is one of the new changes that was brought in July this year. So what that does is that brings us to 15 years beyond the end of the local plan review period. So we wanted to consult on that. That would be a vision for strategic sites going up to 2052, I think. The document itself focuses on 5 potential development strategy options, including the council's preferred option, which is for a more dispersed strategy overall when you consider existing sites and bearing fruits sort of for the whole sort of plan period. There's also a series of questions in the Reg 18 document around how we can address our challenges, including climate change, biodiversity net gain, place shaping and design, protecting and enhancing our environment and heritage, providing new homes, what type of new homes, and focusing on the economy and our town centres too. So next, what I want to do is go through a series of maps with you, just to explain the journey, if you like. I'm not sure if everybody can see this. It's actually really quite clear on my screen. Hopefully the same applies for you. This is a map showing what we call high-level constraints. And these are identified in national planning policy in the NPPF. And they include things like internationally and nationally designated sites for their environmental or ecological value. So this is things that you might have heard of: special protection area, special areas of conservation, triple SIs, that sort of thing. And also includes local green spaces and the AONB, areas of outstanding natural beauty, and land at high risk of flooding or coastal change, in ancient woodland and so on. Now, the thing that's interesting about this is you would expect me to say these are high-level constraints, therefore, if somebody comes along with a development proposal, it's a hard no. They're high-level environmental constraints, that's it, go away. But the thing is, you can actually develop land covered by some of these designations. So for example, the AONB, the area of outstanding natural beauty, development within that area could be allowed, but it would be a question of scale and whether or not it would be possible to mitigate the impacts of the development on the AONB. So for example, the development proposals would be looking to use design layout, materials and landscaping, that sort of thing, to mitigate against harm. And if they were able to demonstrate that the overall benefits outweighed the harm, then development in that context could be acceptable. And similarly with land at risk of flooding, other factors come into play. If you think about old industrial sites at the riverside in places like Maidstone, the old Trebor Bassett factory springs to mind, Tunbridge, Medway as well. In terms of sustainability, these sites on the river, they are well located for access to shops and services and public transport and so on. Very sustainable locations. If the development can be made safe and the regeneration benefits justify it, then development could be supported in these locations. And I just really wanted to make that point, that there are exceptions, but that they have to be justified. Okay, so this next slide shows local level constraints, and you'll see that there are many overlaps with the constraints map that I showed you on the previous slide. And again, these are generally a no. This includes local level designations, including the old county level landscape designations that have been around for a very, very long time, along with our own Swale local landscape designations, local wildlife sites, local nature reserves, and so on. This map. Apologies for the busyness of it, but I think it really goes to show what a rich and diverse borough we have. And I think what's interesting about local level constraints is that they don't necessarily prevent development, but they do impact on the development capacity of an area. So you might have a site that's in a sustainable location, for example, but it includes part of a conservation area or a group of listed buildings. It wouldn't necessarily preclude development from taking place, but obviously those important heritage assets would constrain the amount of land in the land parcel that could be developed, because the setting and impact on the heritage asset would need to be taken into consideration. Okay, so this slide is showing our unconstrained areas, which are basically our urban centres, which of course are already developed. So if you put it all together, here's the map that you're looking at, which is basically saying you need to look at the green bits when thinking about where you could allocate development to meet your development needs for the future. But of course, we know that there are other issues we need to take into consideration, such as traffic, transport, air quality, infrastructure capacity, and so on and so on. And the 5 development strategies presented in the Reg 18 are those that we think could deliver our development needs, although of course they do all have their own pros and cons. Now, to progress with the local plan review, we've also got to consider other factors. We have to find out look at what our evidence tells us, our technical studies. We have to think about what our infrastructure requirements are. Unfortunately, where we have infrastructure capacity issues, we only really have an option of using development to enable the provision of additional infrastructure. That's how these things are funded. We have the sustainability appraisal. That's a really important tool that we use to inform our decisions. Basically, this is a high level assessment of the development strategy options based on set criteria. It doesn't give an overall score. There's no winners or losers in the sustainability appraisal process. It's purely a tool that flags up pros and cons of each of the options. We do take into consideration consultation responses. We're obligated under the regulations and the Act to make sure that we can demonstrate how we've addressed the main issues that have been raised at consultation stages in the local plan itself. Duty to cooperate, I don't know if this is something that you're familiar with. This is where we have to be able to demonstrate that we have cooperated with our neighbours on cross-boundary issues. So this would be on issues like Friendly Corner or just anything really. Now, the last bullet point here, test of soundness, I've put this in because when we get to the examination stage for the local plan, ultimately this is what the inspector is going to be looking at. Was the plan positively prepared? Was it justified? Is it justified, sorry, is it effective, and is it consistent with national policy? And that is what is always at the front of our minds is, we want a sound plan. Are these 4 tests that are used at examination? They're never far from our minds. Is this, have we got this right? Okay, and then just sort of building into the mix, I did mention that the NPPF, the National Planning Policy Framework, was updated in July this year. And it introduced this paragraph where larger scale developments should have a vision that spans at least 30 years. But there were some other changes in there too that were worth our while just taking a pause for a minute and making sure that we were adequately addressing them. So flooding from all sources is something that's now very much front and centre within the NPPF. And also, we're coming sort of out of the other side of the COVID pandemic, and the impacts of that are starting to sort of bed down. And we've got the opportunity through this consultation to ask about what our response to that should be. We're seeing some real changes in the role of the retail sector and our town centres. We've got a lot more home working, commuting patterns, travel to work patterns. That's something that's changing too, and along with a little bit of sort of movement and reshaping in our employment sector. Okay, so the formal consultation started at the end of October. It ends on the 29th of November. All representations must be made in writing. We do have an online consultation portal system. You don't have to use it. If you just want to bung us an email or stick a letter in the post, that is absolutely fine. There should be paper copies of the questionnaire in your local libraries. Again, you can print these from the website, or you can use the interactive PDF. Documents are at all of the libraries in the borough. If you want your very own copy, that's not a problem. Give us a shout, we'll get that posted out to you. In terms of what happens next, we will be summarising all of the responses to the comments received, because that's really critical information that will help us shape the next draft plan. But one thing I think is really important to say is, we have got this formal Reg 18 consultation period, but we would very much like to continue working with our town and parish councils and the wider community where development may be proposed, to sort of answer questions and share information as we go along. And that's it. I hope I haven't sent you all to sleep. Thanks very much for listening, and I'll hand back to you. Thank you, Councillor Hook.
Anthony, you're on mute. You're speaking on mute, Anthony.
Thank you, Chris. Jill, thank you for your presentation. That was really helpful, and I'm sure that will stimulate lots of people asking questions. Please do indicate if you'd like to ask a question in the chat box, or you can write your question out and I'll read it for you if that's easier for people. We're going to prioritise questions from residents. We've got a number of local councillors here tonight, but local councillors will have other opportunities to have their say. So I'm going to take some questions from councillors, but if I have a choice, I'll take residents, other residents. Councillors are residents too, but people who are not councillors first. So I'm just going to look at the chat box now, and I think Matthew Hedgewell, it has, in fact, Christine has asked my chat box has just gone because we've lost the screen. There, here we are. Sorry, I just need to read that again. Christine has said, can we have a sound link for where people can put comments on the consultation ending 29th of November? Christine, I'm not quite sure what you mean by a sound link. I don't know if you just want to explain that. Perhaps if you want to write a further comment just to explain that. Unless, Jill, is that something that do you understand what is meant by that?
I'm sorry, no, I don't.
Christine, explain to us what
what I meant was I wanted to have an email, a very clear email contact where one could get hold of this format in terms of sending it in, because I know sometimes when one comments on these things, it has to follow a particular format. And so I was asking, but I didn't mean sound in hearing. I meant in, you know, a definite place where
Sound
you
as in
would.
it works. Got
Yeah,
you.
yeah, it works.
Okay.
Yeah.
A sound like, yeah, I understand. Jill, I don't know if you can answer that one straight away.
Yes, of course. So the document itself has a number of questions, and if you want to spoil us, please do answer, you know, sort of give your responses as per the questions. But you know what? If you want to just send us an email and give us your thoughts, that's absolutely fine. They will still be taken into consideration, and they will have exactly the same weight as questionnaire responses.
Okay.
And my email, there's 2 email addresses on the last slide. So, sorry, I was a bit hasty taking that down. But perhaps if you're circulating the slides.
Yeah, listen, do you want to, I'm going to go to Matthew's question next. While I'm reading that out, do you want to just type the email address in the chat box, Jill? Is that okay?
If I can figure out how to.
I'll leave you to do that. I'm going to read
find
Matthew Hatchwell's question then. He says, thanks for the presentation. In 2019, SBC commissioned a landscape sensitivity assessment, which evaluated land across the borough for its sensitivity to housing and commercial development. It's difficult to see how the conclusions of that study are reflected in the 5 options we're being presented with in this consultation, which ignore large areas of high sensitivity around Faversham. It's not even mentioned in the October 2021 sustainability assessment of the 5 options. Shouldn't development be focused mainly on the areas of low sensitivity? Okay, so could I ask John or Jill to address that question?
Yes, I mean, I think, you know, it's fair to say that we don't have any easy choices here, and there's a degree of weight around the various sort of pieces of evidence, and it is one factor amongst a whole, you know, sort of broad range of evidence. And I think that the 5 development strategies that we set out in the Regulation 18 document, they are pretty high level. But certainly those are exactly the sorts of comments that we're looking for if people have got particular concerns or feel that certain options don't adequately respond to that sort of information. We'd be very glad to hear from you. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. And by all means, folks, if you want to ask a supplementary, type it in the chat box as well. So Matthew's case, if you want to ask something further, type that. Well, Matthew might potentially be typing. I'm going to Chris Barker, who said he had a question.
There is another question from, I think it's not Gillian. I think there's somebody sitting behind Gillian's email address. If you want to take that first.
That's our friend Tim Ingram. Nice to see you, Tim. Tim, do you want to read your question? You're on mute, Tim. Sorry, I may have taken you by surprise.
Yes. Yeah, I just wondered how larger scale developments are going to be able to ratchet up responses to climate change, which is such a significant factor over the planned period and beyond, really up to 2050, which is really required by COP26. And the serious constraints that you've just described in the borough, do these not question the housing targets that Swale is faced with?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, you know, in this world, it does seem sort of counterintuitive on the one hand to be trying to deal with challenges that we faced with climate change, and then on the other hand to be told that we need to deliver rather a lot of additional development. we are concerned about our ability to meet the numbers, the housing numbers that are required of us. And we do watch and monitor what's happening elsewhere in the country, because we're certainly not alone in this. We've yet to find any local authorities that have managed to progress with a sound local plan using a housing target below what the algorithm is telling them that they need to provide. And what is becoming abundantly clear is that it's not enough to have the evidence that demonstrates you cannot meet that housing number. The problem of where that unmet need goes remains with the local planning authority. So for argument's sake, say we were able to provide evidence that said we can't meet this number, but we can meet a lower number, and we had a shortfall of 4,000, just for fun, let's pick that number. Where that 4,000 is met remains our problem, and we would have to engage through duty to cooperate with our neighbouring authorities to try and get agreement from them that they meet that. We know that with one exception, our neighbours are in a very similar position, and the Kent-wide picture is really looking quite precarious.
Tim, did you want to ask a supplementary question at all?
Well, thank you for that. Yes. No, I mean, I understand it in many ways, but I think it's still a question that needs to be asked. And KCC also asked it. So I wonder how much really this is a matter for Kent as a whole and the boroughs in Kent as a whole going forward.
Joe, if I may just pick up a question arising from that. You said one of our neighbours was different to the others, and I think that's probably Canterbury, who've been reporting in local press that the leader of Canterbury Council wants to build many more houses than their requirement. Does that help us in Swale potentially keep our expansion under some control?
I think at this stage, it's prudent for me to say that this is something we're keeping a very close eye on. We do meet on a fairly regular basis with all of our neighbours to talk about cross-boundary issues. And we are looking at our emerging evidence to try and get a handle on whether or not we have a justification for planning for a lower number. But I have to say the bar is set incredibly high. Watch this space.
John, I'm going to go to some other people in a minute, but John has said he wants to ask a question rising out of that, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Jill or James. So I acknowledge the challenges that Swale are likely to have by putting in a figure different into the local plan that's reflected in this using the standard methodology. There is, however, a question in the Reg 18 consultation asking, do you think the council should attempt to justify not complying with the government standard method? It sounds to me like you've presupposed the answer to that, which is we can't really do it. And my question is this, is there the political will at Swale to challenge the government's housing targets? You know, there's been a significant amount of rhetoric from government ministers around building in greenfield and so on. Is there the political will to call those politicians out and actually challenge them on the housing targets which are imposed by central government?
I'll have a go at that one, Jill. She's smiling. It's James Freeman here, Head of Planning again. Just say our members are always trying to challenge the government on the housing figures. And you would have heard in the press about 2 or 3 weeks ago, I think it was Michael Gove was talking about brownfield development and so forth. There does appear to be some suggestion that the government obviously have held off with the proposed white paper on planning and the planning system. And there is some discussion, I think, taking at central government about looking at the algorithm that they use for the standard calculation for housing. And they are particularly looking at how the north of England versus the south of England issues might influence that algorithm. So we're sort of waiting to hear from government how that may sort of move forward, and that could potentially look at reducing housing numbers in the south east. Be interesting to see how that does pan out in practice. I think also, as Jill has mentioned, there is an incredibly high bar evidence as it currently stands on the housing numbers to justify lower numbers. If we were to go down that line, we would need a very strong evidence base, because obviously then that brings in duty to cooperate and our neighbouring authorities' willingness to take on some of those numbers. They'll be challenging our evidence at the same time. So we've got to be very clear when we do get to an examination with a local planning inspector, if we were to go down that route, that we have got that strong evidence to support the case we're putting forward. So that's where we're interested to hear comments from people where they believe there is that evidence to support that, whether that's on the infrastructure side of things, whether it's on the environmental side of things. But as Jill's done with the presentation, she's already explained to you the high level constraints. That's really the only area in which the government usually sort of accepts any suggestion that no development should take place in those areas. I hope that's helpful.
Okay, thanks, James. We'll go on to the next question. I'm going to take someone's gone by the name of Maloney. I don't know if you want to tell us your full name so we know who it is. But the question is, I'll take the question anyway. Do the HRA/Stodmarsh issues impact on any allocations? Jill or James, do you have any comment on that?
I'll just come in very briefly. The Stodmarsh issue, there's only a very small portion of the borough towards the southwest of the borough, which is part of the rural area, and it's not something where we're looking development to take place. So we're not really affected by the Stodmarsh issue.
Okay. Next question is from Christine. Can I ask, are the big developments already happening around Faversham incorporated into these targets, or is it a start at point zero? Does what in effect is a new small town built by the Duchy of Cornwall on the outskirts, also on prime farmland and across woodland, counted? Is that counted in this too?
So in terms of exact sites, this consultation doesn't specifically identify them, and the focus is very much on that high level. But within the document, there is a map that sets out all of the sites that have been promoted through both the Reg 19 consultation that took place earlier in the year and through earlier studies through the call for sites. So we know that the Duchy site is very well progressed. It doesn't have planning permission. I don't want to sort of preempt, because there's nothing is set in stone at this stage, but certainly I think there's a very clear intention from the Duchy to progress with that site. And it would go a long way in meeting our housing requirements.
So Jill, just so we all understand correctly, so the Duchy isn't a definite, it hasn't got planning permission yet, but if it does get planning permission, that number of houses will count towards the target you've talked about. It will be part of that. That's right, isn't it?
That's absolutely right. If it progresses as a local plan allocation,
right,
it will form part of it will meet our housing, meet some of our housing need.
And the first part of Christine's question was about development that's going on now, where they've started but haven't finished. So we've got the Perry Court development to the south, which I think isn't going to be finished for several years, and there's more building going on east of Love Lane. People obviously see houses are still being built at these spots and other places too, off the Western Link, I think, as well.
Anderson's, yeah.
They in a sense, in terms of Christine's question, they don't count towards this number, do they? Because they already had planning permission in the previous cycle. Is that how it works?
Broadly speaking, yes, that's absolutely right. So if we look at what our annual requirement is, our annual requirement now is 1,048 dwellings per year. And that figure does not become fixed until we submit the plan to the Secretary of State, because that figure of 1048 is worked out using a government formula called the standard method. And there are updates to the figures that we have to use. So this time last year, the figure was 1038. Now it's gone up to 1048. So for the 16 years of the new, the review, the total housing requirement is 16,768, but we know we've already got sites in the pipeline. And I am so sorry, I'm overcomplicating all this, but in a nutshell, things that already have been identified as local plan allocations are not, they could be part of the 16,768, but that number is going to keep changing. That was just really not a very straight answer at all, was it? Sorry, let me try again. So the question is, all of the sites that are currently being built, do they count towards our current housing need or our emerging housing need?
Well, I think what Chrissy means, but she'll come in and correct me. What she means is, you've said in the new local plan, Swale will have an obligation to find sites for X thousand houses. Do the ones that have been granted planning permission are in the process of being built, but we won't see them yet for a little while, do they count towards that number, or is the number you got to find on top of what's already been granted planning permission?
It's on top of this, not the 16,000, because there's an overlap with the two plan periods. Okay. So yes, sites that are already on the table, they're already allocations in bearing fruit, would not be included as part of the we'll put it this way: if bearing fruits starts, the base date for bearing fruits is 2014, and it runs to 2031. So all of the sites in bearing fruits provide for the need during that period. So we would take that figure away from the new figure, but the new figure goes beyond that, doesn't it, up to 2038. So I could have just said yes and saved us all a lot of headache. Sorry. In a nutshell, yes, but it's not quite that simple.
Okay,
sorry,
that's helpful. I think that was understandable. They will count up until 2031. I think if you had to summarize it in a sentence, I think that's the answer. I'm going to move on now to David Hadley's question, which is about water. David's written, wastewater infrastructure managed by Southern Water is acknowledged by them to be under stress. Can we be assured that building developments will have their wastewater and sewage management assured without further pollution before building commences?
Do you want me to take that one, Jill? Right. I know this is a topic of the moment, I think, particularly in Faversham, because you've had the flooding incidences. I always get that word wrong over the last few months, haven't you, particularly? And I suspect it will happen again. Now, with the way that it works with the water companies, because they're private companies, they're not subject to what's called the Section 106 SIL requirements. And they have to produce what's called a 5-year plan every year. It's a rolling plan, and they have to produce that every year to say what infrastructure they're going to provide to meet the development needs. And this is nationally, not just locally. So they have a responsibility through Ofwat and others to make sure they're providing all the infrastructure necessary to meet the development needs of the country as a whole and of Faversham. So that's what they should be doing. There are instances, obviously, where you get large scale development that may need a large bit of infrastructure or kit that's required to manage the water supply or the water sewerage, etc. And developers will be providing that jointly with the water companies themselves. But generally, the responsibility is for the water companies. So obviously you get developers coming on site, they'll put the infrastructure that's needed on site, but whatever's needed off site, the water companies have to provide and connect into it.
Okay. David, did you want to ask any follow-up to that? David Hadley's question. David, if you do, type it in the chat box. I'll go to the next question. Well, you're just considering that. Matthew, I'm going, folks, roughly in the order in which people are writing the questions. Matthew says he's got a follow-up question about ACOM sustainability. Matthew, if you want to ask that, perhaps you just explain to everybody else what ACOM is. Not everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. So ACOM was the company that was contracted, if I understand correctly, by the Borough Council to carry out the interim sustainability assessment that is linked to the consultation document that we've been looking at. And it's great that that assessment is being done, but it seems incredibly narrow. And basically all it does is compare the 5 options. It doesn't actually relate them to anything like the green and blue infrastructure strategy, or evaluate them for their compatibility with a nature recovery network in the borough. So, you know, it's rather simplistic, and particularly simplistic is the table that's presented at the beginning, which evaluates the 5 options against a whole series of criteria and ranks them. And the worst conclusion from my perspective, I think, is that option 5, which is this kind of so-called garden village option, comes out as number 1, I guess, for the borough as a whole. It's evaluated as being the best option across the borough as a whole. But for large parts of the borough, it would be by far the worst one. So it's much too simplistic for this study to reach a single conclusion across the entire borough, because the picture is going to be very varied from one part of Swale to another.
Chris, you had your hand up there, Chris. Was that something urgent you wanted to
say? Yeah, it's kind of related, and to support Matthew's view, really. The CPRE, the charity related to kind of rural England, made a fairly detailed response at Reg 19, and I've got other questions about this, Anthony, which I'll hold back on because I'm specifically about sort of the wider sustainability assessment. And the comment that they make is, broadly, insufficient consideration has been given to genuine reasonable alternatives to Faversham growth and sustainability appraisal. Their political steer has given focus upon Faversham at the beginning of the essay process, undermines the notions that the alternatives presented later were ever realistic options, or the strategy has been evidence-based led. And I look upon that and the ACOM assessments in broadly the same light. I mean, they feel fairly superficial and fairly guided, and I'm quite concerned that we're placing a lot of emphasis on those assessments, and that, frankly, the strategic options that are still on the table have not taken into account comments at Reg 19 at this point. But yeah, I just wanted to support Matthew on his view about the kind of superficiality of the ACOM work.
Okay, thanks. Jill and James, do you want to comment on what Matthew and Chris have said? You're on mute there, Jill.
How about now? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So I mean, I think you've really hit the nail on the head there, Matthew, when you talk about the essay being sort of specific and simplistic, and that is absolutely the role of the essay. It's not a tool that drills down into detail or considers the nuances. It is purely this high level assessment, but just sort of for information, you can comment on the sustainability appraisal on the interim report too, and similarly, if you don't feel that any of the 5 options are an option that you can support, you can certainly suggest alternative options. I mean, I think what might be worth saying is that you know, there are lots and lots of different strands of information that inform a development strategy and site selection, and that is something that you know will sort of be set out in much more detail at the next stage.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm going to take 2 questions together because they're both to do with process. It might be convenient to put together. Philip has it's in a direct message to me, so others may not be able to see it, but that's no problem. The question is, with such a large impact on local parishes, why choose such a short consultation period without prior public notification? So why is the consultation period that it is? And Sue Ackhurst has asked, the duty to cooperate, is the duty to cooperate for contiguous boroughs only or for others in Kent? And she asked a separate question about Manston, but perhaps we'll take those 2 process questions. Why the consultation period and the duty to cooperate? What does that mean in terms of who does it apply to?
Okay, so the consultation period for a Reg 18, there isn't actually a set number of weeks. Other authorities have had Reg 18 consultations lasting 3 weeks, but just within the wider sort of picture of trying to progress with a local plan, because of course there are significant risks with having a plan that is out of date, and given that we had a very long and very detailed consultation response at Reg 19, we felt on balance that 4 weeks would be sufficient in this case. And then just to answer the question about duty to cooperate, it basically applies to immediate neighbours, KCC, and anybody else that you feel it's appropriate to engage with. So I'll give you an example. I recently had an email from a local planning authority in Surrey, I think it was Surrey, asking us under the duty to cooperate if we would be open to taking some of their unmet housing need.
What was the answer?
Can't you guess?
I just want to check.
It was a hard no.
Love to hear it.
Yes, but as we move forward, we will have statements of statements of common ground with each of our neighbours and with KCC and with statutory consultees as well.
Okay, Sue's further question, more substantive point is, as it seems unlikely Manston Airport will go ahead now, there's a chance that land could be used for housing, which could be a very large development. I think I've seen some draft proposals, I think at County Hall, some developers. There are two competing developers, and one of them wants to build a lot of houses. I can't remember the number. Could that be to our benefit, perhaps in terms of reducing the numbers to be built in Swale?
Well, under sort of previous planning regimes where we did have county-wide or sort of regional planning, those are absolutely the sorts of discussions that we would be having, and we would be looking at areas with potential or the drive to have the growth, to take the growth. I think, yeah, it's definitely one to watch. Yeah.
Okay, good. Next question is from Carol G. Has the number of brownfield sites available in Swale, has the number of brownfield sites available in Swale been calculated? How many empty homes are there? Kent County Council seems to be holding back on repossessing long-term empty homes. Empty shops are now able to be converted, ? So a number of questions there about brownfield sites, empty homes, empty shops. How do they play into this, Jill or James?
Want me to go in first, Jill, and then?
Yeah, go on.
Okay. Just on the brownfield sites, now we believe we're probably maxed out on what brownfield sites are available to us. If there are sites that anybody thinks we haven't looked at, please identify them to us. Obviously, there's some larger scale brownfield sites which are allocated and coming forward incredibly slowly, particularly on Sheppey, contributing to the Queenborough regeneration scheme, for example, because they are difficult viability schemes to bring forward. So it's been a bit slow. We're working with Homes England, never quite sure their titles nowadays, to sort of accelerate development on those sites. But it's something which the council's very concerned about, that we do max out on our brownfield sites that we've got available, but we think we've covered all those in terms of proposals coming forward in the plan. I can't comment on Kent County Council holding back on repossessing long-term empty homes. You'll need to speak to Kent County on that. I'm not in a position to comment on that. Now, empty shops, there have been quite significant changes to development management in terms of permitted development. So you can change from commercial uses to residential without planning permission to a certain extent, with the new permitted development rights which have been introduced by the government. And I think you'll see in quite a few town centres quite major housing development coming forward, usually flattered development or townhouse development rather than normal housing development. And I think the council have been promoting Sittingbourne Town Centre particularly for quite large scale redevelopment, and they're looking for around about 850 dwellings to come forward through that process. I think you might find some of that coming forward in Faversham on a much smaller scale because of the nature and historic quality of Faversham Town Centre, etc. But we are expecting some development in Sheerness town centres and some of the more village centres as well occurring through that process. And that's been taken into account in the numbers that we're expecting to come forward, as I mentioned, through the town centre developments or through windfall sites particularly. Hope that's helpful.
And the last bit of Carol's question was, can empty shops be converted? I think the simple answer is yes, they can. An owner could apply for planning permission to convert an empty shop if they wanted.
Well, as I say, there's permitted development rights. I think the issue is the other way around for our councillors. They want to protect the retail core of many of the town centres, and this relaxation of permitted development rights could threaten that to a certain extent. So there may need to be consideration of what's called Article 4 directions, which remove permitted development rights in certain areas. And in Faversham, you've got an Article 4, which relates to window frames and so forth. So It's sort of a similar process to that. And I think we need to seriously consider looking at Article 4s either for Faversham and or Sittingbourne or other town or village centres that we have to protect that retail core.
Yeah. What happens about derelict buildings? I mean, I'm speaking for myself here. This may not represent the views of my fellow councillors, but I find it painful when I walk down Preston Street and see Kane's Amusements like a derelict, as derelict as you can imagine, been like that for years. And that could be made into a shop. It could also be made into a place for someone to live. We're on the Canterbury Road, just by the KCC, Kent Highways Depot. There's a derelict building with no roof and trees going through it. Can we make the owners of derelict places like that do something with it?
Potentially up to a point. We can serve what's called a section 215 notice, where you got an untidy land. That doesn't necessarily bring it back into use or an occupation. It sort of just brings back the property to a good state of repair and appearance in the street scene. It's more difficult to bring something back into use because we're not the landowner. We don't have that control.
Okay, well, perhaps that's a power we could look at some of the grot spots, but let's just go back to the next question. The next question is from Becky Smart, and she asks, it's a bit of overlap with the previous question. She says there should only be brownfield housing quota targets, no more high speculative targets, reviewed on an annual basis. We can't go on building on green fields, carbon sinks. It's in direct contravention of the carbon zero mandate, not to mention the creation of significant food insecurity by building on our farms. Jill, James, would you like to respond to that?
I have a lot of sympathy with that view, Becky. You know, there does seem a bit of, you know, it does all seem to be a bit at odds, doesn't it? On the one hand, we're trying to embrace measures to address climate change, and on the other hand, we're being asked to deliver nearly 17,000 new homes as part of this local plan review. I think first and foremost, just to sort of build on what James has said, as town planners, our first port of call when we are looking at sites to allocate in a local plan, bring forward for development, we are looking for brownfield sites within the urban areas, sustainable locations where there's the good access to these shops and services and facilities and so on. But the fact of the matter is, this is not a new concept or idea. This is something that we've been doing at least since I was a baby planner, coming up to 30 years, you know, sort of in my career. And you know, they're just not there. We have a brownfield register. We keep it up to date. And there's an inadequate number of sites on the register and available within Swale Borough to really make much of a dent in our housing numbers at all.
Okay, thanks, Jill. Shelley Roos has got a question. I think, again, with everybody's questions, actually, if you've got a follow-up, just put it in the chat box and we'll come to it when we can. Shelley Roos has got a question. Let's not forget, we are nationally in a housing crisis, and the number is based on the borough's demographic data. Whatever the number, we need to build houses to accommodate our local population, rather than finding a way to wriggle out of planning for them. I'll take the next question as well, and then perhaps I invite you to comment on what Shelley has said and what the next question says as well. That's Claire Lampard is the next one. If government targets are reduced after the local plan is drawn up, do developers still get the green light to develop the land included, even if the house numbers are no longer needed? So just to recap, Shelley's comment really is, we're in a housing crisis. We need houses to accommodate local population. Let's not try and wriggle out of that. And Claire's question is, if the government targets reduce, will developers still be able to build these houses even if they're no longer needed? Jill or James, whichever you would like to take those.
I'll take Shelley's point, if I may. Shelley, you are absolutely right. No, we simply have, as a nation, we simply have not built the number of houses that we've needed over the last 30 to 40 years. I think we've only built about 60% of what we've needed. And, you know, this isn't a new phenomenon. This has happened historically at least twice that I can think of. It's why nationally we had a new towns programme, and why the public sector built lots of houses in the interwar and post-war period, home for heroes and all that kind of stuff. But that is, you know, that is where we are. We do have a housing crisis, and this manifests itself by housing becoming more and more unaffordable. And you know, thinking about what Becky said and what Shelley said, you know, there's definitely a balance to be struck there, because where will our children live?
Thank you.
Okay.
And James, did you want to add anything on that?
I think Jill's answered that one. I think looking at, I've never been a professional planner for over many years now, 30 odd years. I can't remember a time when the housing numbers have gone down, they've always gone up. So I'm not quite sure we've experienced that. I think my initial advice on that would be, you know, if a local plan went through, that would then set the housing numbers at that point. If there was a change to the numbers, it wouldn't be until the next review of the local plan you could take that into account with further housing allocations beyond that point, because it's a rolling process, it never stops. So I suspect you readjust your figures at the next local plan review period, and you probably have to allocate less development than you would normally have expected to.
James, that's a really important and interesting point, because I have heard some people suggest that if we wait, the central government target might reduce. Do you see any prospect of that happening whatsoever?
It's really difficult to say. As I mentioned, Michael Gove said what he did a few weeks ago, and that caused a bit of a hiatus with many leaders of many councils across the country. Okay. And it is my understanding they are re-looking at the algorithm, and possibly as part of that, the split between the amount of housing that should be in the south of England compared to the north of England. But no, I don't know what's being said at central government level. We don't know what's going to be coming out in the next few months, or however long the government decides to take before they bring out a new white paper and a new algorithm. So I can't really answer that at this stage. The issue we've got is our local plan is 5 years old in July next year. And the government, if you look at an NPPF, as you get past 5 years, your plan starts becoming out of date, and you've got less control over development. So there is a need for the council really to proceed with getting the local plan in place as quickly as it can, really. Obviously making sure it's got a sound plan as it moves forward.
So I mean, someone might say, if there's a possibility of the target decreasing, let's wait and see if that happens. But what you just said there is there would be other risks from waiting. And can you just expand on that, just to help us understand a bit more? What would be the risks of waiting?
Well, the risks are, we've got an out-of-date local plan. It doesn't take into account the new housing number, whatever it is, you know, which it was 776 in the current adopted local plan. As it stands at the moment, from 2022 onwards, we've got to be planning for 1,048 dwellings, as Jill said. So every year we don't get the plan in place to cover that, we're more prone to ad hoc development coming forward from sites that we're not looking to promote. And obviously that gets quite difficult if you haven't got your 5-year supply of housing. It gets quite complicated to justify the approach that's been taken in the adopted local plan or any emerging local plan at that stage. So it becomes quite risky. And I don't think that's really in the interest of the council to hold off getting a new plan in place sooner rather than later, after that July sort of cut-off deadline.
Okay, Chris has got his hand up just there.
Just on that, James, and I don't mean to be disparaging of the planning team, because you've been under direction of the members of Swale Borough Council. But we find ourselves going back round the buoy on Regulation 18 precisely because we didn't do it properly last time. And if we've got significant time pressures on completing this local plan review, it's because we created that. We created that as a borough. And I'm quite disappointed that we could be in a position where ultimately decisions are taken out of our hands because we haven't been able to complete this plan in a proper way. And I think Swell needs to take some accountability for the failings in the last run at this, which pushes us back a year or more.
The only comment I make there, when you look at the picture, you know, within Kent, even never mind nationally, a lot of authorities are really struggling with the local plans. So, you know, Sevenoaks, Tunbridge and Morling, they've all fallen foul of bringing forward their plans. So it's not unique to Swale. Medway have had to hold up their local plan recently. It's just a very difficult climate at the moment because of the way, I suppose, planning policy generally is a bit up in the air, waiting for the white paper and central government providing advice, and it's sort of tampering and changing the system constantly. So it's not until it's gone through examinations elsewhere or case law from other places that you tend to learn how planning systems are supposed to operate. So I don't think it's just unique to Swale that they've fallen foul of this, and to a certain extent, no, the current administration, they got the comments they got from the Reg 19. There was some opposition to what was being proposed through the Reg 19, and they want to just re-look at that again as part of the process, what they're doing now. So they see this as part of the process of trying to bring the community along with them more than they had done when they introduced the Reg 19, with whatever proposals they're going to come forward and test out.
Okay. I'm going to go to Jerry now. Jerry's asked 2 questions. I'll read them one at a time. I think Jerry might not be a Faversham town resident, but I'm going to exercise my discretion to take his questions in any event. Jerry's first question is, since COVID lockdowns, traffic levels in small country lanes have increased dramatically, mostly delivery lorries and vans. Road traffic speed, although less than the legal speed limit, is far too high for safe driving. Developing new housing in the area of outstanding natural beauty will only impact road traffic safety further. Are the planning officers seriously considering developing new homes in the AONB? And Jerry's further question is, with COVID, more people seem to want to move out of the cities and towns into the countryside. Is this wish to move into the countryside influencing the planning policies of the development areas? Jill or James?
And to answer the question about giving, you know, are we seriously considering developing in the area of outstanding natural beauty? The short answer is no, but it has to be balanced with any need or potential to support and sustain rural communities, whether they're in the AONB or in other areas. Now, I've already mentioned that there are no specific sites identified in this Reg 18 consultation, but we do ask the question about whether or not small scale development in rural areas is wanted or appropriate. And it's always difficult to get that balance right. But certainly, when I was talking about how it is possible to develop in the AONB in my presentation, it was really just to make the point that there are certain things where it's a hard no, and other areas where things are a little bit grayer, but there was no sort of hidden message behind that. And the issue about traffic levels, sorry, remind me, I didn't write it down.
I think the general thrust of it was Jerry's seen an increase in traffic since COVID in the rural areas. Is that not a reason perhaps to not build houses where traffic will be made worse? I mean, you might ask the same question in parts of Faversham where traffic is very heavy, perhaps Offspring, for example, pollution is very bad. Will the traffic level, will the pollution level be taken into account when we decide where to give permission to and where to refuse permission?
Do you want me to give it a go then, Jill?
Yeah, on you go.
On air quality side of things, obviously you got the AQMAs, and you mentioned Ospringe, which has got an air quality management action area. That's closely monitored, and the proposals that's brought forward in the plan will have to make sure it doesn't exceed this the objectives set out for the air quality management action areas across the borough. So we can't see any exceedances being caused by the new development occurring. So that will be one of the tests of soundness that will be applied there. When it comes to traffic generally, well, there is an assessment done through the local plan, which is sort of a high level assessment doing, and we've got a transport modelling being undertaken at the moment and will be reported through to the panel and needs to be in place for when we do come forward with a Reg 19 document, which will be looking at the preferred option that the council may want to proceed with. There's also then the development management side of things, so there needs to be a full transport assessment, and if there are constraints or capacity issues, then that needs to be taken into account in the decision making through those planning applications as they come forward. So that is taken into account, and obviously KCC are the highway authority and would be advising the council on those matters.
Okay. Carol G has asked a very simple, straightforward question. Where can we access the document about Southern Water, James? I think you mentioned a document about Southern Water. Can we get that?
Yeah, I would have thought on Southern Water's website, they need to produce a 5-year plan. I haven't been on their website recently, but we've got a copy of it in our records in the office, I suspect. But it should be available from Southern Water if people need to get hold of it.
Just remind us of what we'll be looking for, what the title is. So Southern Water's 5-year plan for...
I don't know its title off the top of my head, but it's a 5-year rolling plan, which all the water companies nationally have to produce. But basically, it's a bidding document to a certain extent because they get government grants to support their operation as well as getting water rates in, which pays for all the infrastructure. So they've got to produce a 5-year infrastructure plan in effect to say what they're going to do in order to meet the development needs of the country in that respect. But it should be available on their websites or through Southern Water themselves.
Okay, we'll see if we can get it from their website. Perhaps if the town council, if we manage to find it, we'll put it on our website or somewhere where people can get hold of it easily if it's not easy on the Southern Water website. John Owen's got a question. Can Mr. Freeman explain the relevance of value judgments?
Anthony, I'm happy to ask it myself if that's okay.
Okay.
Just firstly though, just before I do, I think a very important comment was made in the chat box that I don't want to lose. It was by Shelley Rouse, who raised the issue of a housing crisis, and I think it shouldn't be lost. It's clear we are in the midst of an affordable housing crisis for sure, and there's a dire need for housing for local people. I think though that we mustn't confuse what we're talking about. Certainly what I'm talking about is getting the right housing in the right place and the right numbers. So, you know, it's not about saying we shouldn't build housing. We desperately need the right housing. And having a quick internet search, I saw that the houses in sale in Perry Court start at 400 to 550,000. I'm not convinced that's the right sort of housing, but of course, that's beyond the control of Swale Borough Council. Just on my question, I've been looking at the 5 allocation choices which are presented in the Reg 18, and clearly we're familiar with them because we saw them previously in the Reg 19. And it's clear that option 3 is the preferred option. One of the criteria that seems to have snuck it in is this idea of rebalancing development across the borough, and it concerns me because the concept of rebalancing is not something I've ever seen in any planning documentation. Clearly, I'm not a planner, but it seems very much a value judgment, and if anything, it seems very politically driven. And I just wonder whether James, you could comment on the politics that are informing the drive to development in the east of the borough, i.e. Faversham versus the west of the borough.
Just finding my mute button there. I'm not the politician, so I can't really answer for the politicians in that way. But obviously, the general discussion which took place was looking at the distribution of development across the borough. So the options you're being presented with are looking at, option, I haven't got them in front of me now, but option 1 is obviously looking at the distribution that was there with the adopted local plan, which was very much focused at that time when we had the Thames Gateway. So it was looking at Sheppey and Sittingbourne really to take quite a significant amount of the development that was being proposed at that time. Obviously, members have looked at this at a wider scale now and looking at these different options, so they come up with the different options and moving towards more balanced distribution of costs across the borough, up to even an option where they're looking at redressing that imbalance by promoting development at the east of the borough. So that's a decision that they've gone through, looking at the evidence that they've got and moving forward with the proposals that they have.
Okay, so just to be clear then, it's a political decision, I think is what you're saying has been made.
Well, ultimately, yes, because it's my members through the local plan panel, through the cabinet, through the full council who makes a decision on what Reg 19 document comes through at the end of the day.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, John. Thanks, James. Next question is from Louise Lees. Thanks for your presentation, Jill. Is there a corresponding commitment from government to make proportionate provision for public transport to help fulfil the promise of keeping 1.5 degrees centigrade of warming alive? Does Swale have a lobbying role here, please? Really good question.
Yeah, tough question too. In the work that we've done so far, we have sought to focus on more active travel. And this is a really difficult one because KCC are the Highways Authority, and we levy by active travel, I mean more walking, more cycling, use of public transport and so on. And how that's funded comes through development. So when you have larger scale developments, you have more funding for those to support those types of activities and measures. And Kent is not great at existing levels of sort of bus and walking. So it's certainly something that we're sort of very ambitious about and want to drive forward. And it's a difficult one because, you know, you look at sort of road infrastructure and you sort of go, oh, we need sort of more roads. You build more roads, you're really building more opportunity for private car use if you're not careful. But it is something we do work very closely with KCC, and they're very clear that that's what our ambitions are. I don't know if James wants to add anything.
The only comment I have, rather than just looking at transport, just carbon emissions, because that's the key element, obviously with the ecological considerations and all sorts, but looking at the carbon emissions situation. The government have been talking about new building regulations, and almost those building regulations would then, if they do what they intended to do through the consultation they undertook last year, would impose that requirement on local planning authorities. So no local planning authority could move away from what the government were insisting on through the building regulations. Now, we haven't had that decision yet, but the way Swale was looking at that through the Reg 19 last year was looking at significant reductions in carbon emission and ratcheting that up over the local plan period. And we had a quite significant input from specialist consultants to bring forward that policy. And that was quite an innovative policy to try and reduce carbon emissions within the borough itself, probably more advanced than any other local planning authority I was aware of at that time. I suspect our members would like to move forward on that basis still, but they may be thwarted by whatever government impositions may come in, and we wait to see what the government does on that score.
Okay, how far are you able to get at the moment in terms of in planning permission requiring buildings to have, say, solar panels, EV charging, energy efficiency, water efficiency? How far can you go at the moment?
Well, as it stands, it's with our current adopted local plan. So the sort of limitations, I suspect, the council did bring in sort of a local policy, which has only got a certain amount of weight, looking at 50% reduction in carbon emissions through the use of air source heat pumps and solar panels, as you say. And we do challenge developers to move in that direction, and we've been successful in certain cases. But it's a balance, because we don't have the policy position to necessarily sustain that on an appeal. So we are dependent on sort of the goodwill of developers to a certain extent to move forward with us on that basis. And again, as I said, we've got specialist consultants to help us on that, to see the relative values and costs involved with moving in that direction. So even though an air source heat pump, I don't know what the latest cost is for that, but if it's £10,000 a unit, you do get an increase in price in the property attached to that. So it's not a 10,000 cost, there's a net cost involved with it. So I think as a council, I think we've been quite proactive in moving in that direction. But again, as I said, we may be, I say thwarted, I'm not quite sure I could say that, but the government may be imposing certain restrictions, and the government, to their credit, have been ratcheting up the requirements against carbon emissions over the last few years. And I'm sure with their stated objectives for becoming carbon zero by 2050 and so forth, that they'll have to ratchet up significantly further through regulation changes as they move forward in policy, whether it's building control or through planning or through environmental regulations.
Will a new local plan enable you to be tougher on developers environmentally, or will it make no difference?
Well, as I say, we're aiming to be tougher on them, and that was taken into account in the Reg 19 document that came out. So obviously the council would need to consider whether it still wanted to carry on with that approach, and I suspect they would. But ultimately, at the end of the day, as I said, the government could stop us from doing that if they put in lesser requirements and stipulated that's what local planning authorities needed to follow in the shorter term.
Okay, thank you. Tim Ingram has posted another question. I think some of it's been covered, Tim. You posted that a while ago. It's taken us a bit of time to get there, about highway traffic levels and the AQMA. Tim, is there anything you want to add by way? Do you want to ask this verbally?
Yes, I could do. It's just really that the Watling Street A2 that runs through the middle of Faversham really is under intense pressure even now. And my question really is, how do we deal with this active travel and making Watling Street a road that people in the town can use to cycle and walk along, rather than being faced with this constant flow of traffic, which really can only get worse. And so it comes down to these traffic models and future capacity, and how much that really is a strong holding pressure on how the local plan goes ahead. Sorry. And I'll add to that the problems about air quality at Osprey, because I know that SBC do monitor, and they try and to show that these levels are within the limits or just only slightly above them. But these concerns have been in the town for so long now, and they haven't really been addressed properly. And what truth is that they will be in the future. We have to trust the council that is the case, and a lot of people may not feel that that's really true. I should add to that, one of the major problems is PM 2.5, of course.
Tim, do you want to explain? There might be some people, we've got 40 or so people.
Sorry, PM 2.5 are the very, very small particles released particularly by sort of tires and braking and those kind of things, which really get into the body and can cause damage to the health in ways that really are not all that clear at the moment, and the levels are really being pushed down by the WHO and EU regulations. So in the future, they will become more stringent.
Okay. Chris, does your hand relate to this?
It does.
Go ahead.
It does. I want to accentuate Tim's point. I want to read a couple of points from the KCC response to the Regulation 19 of the last local plan review document. The two comments are, it says, the proposed partnership work on the A2 mitigation strategy is welcomed. However, in recognising there is mitigation required, it is difficult to understand why development is proposed along its corridor. And it goes on to say the proposed transport strategy cannot be supported by KCC as the local highway authority until such a time as it has been properly informed by modelling evidence and amended accordingly. You know, CPRE talk about this. You know, Tim's, you know, elucidate on the ACMA issues far more eloquent than I could do. But transport has been a key response to the engagement so far from a lot of the strategic stakeholders in any local plan. And I guess my question, and I think it's kind of the same as Tim's really, which is, what I don't understand is, having had a second bite of the cherry because we failed to deliver the plan properly the first time around, why aren't the strategic options taking into account those very strong voices about the transport problems created by these strategic options that still remain? Why are there strategic options in there that clearly will go and deliver the exact problems that are being called about? That's what I want to understand.
Can I come in, Chair? This is, I sort of tend to agree with what Chris is saying. It's really difficult. Wherever you put development in Swale, everything almost trickles down to the A2 and to the motorway junctions. That's the nature of Swale in the way that it's structured, and it is probably one of the major issues that we're going to have to really look at seriously and consider how it's going to, whatever development strategy you come forward with, however you do it, whether it's our preferred strategy or whether it's more dispersed or whether you put everything onto the island or whatever else, is causing potential issues there. So we're always looking at what those implications are. We're looking at how much can we really achieve through modal shift, active travel, those types of arrangements, how we can change the highway network to move traffic into places which will be less impactful in an adverse way. You know, can we direct more travel off the A2 onto the M2 more to relieve traffic through Faversham and through Ospringe? They are the big issues that we're going to have to consider.
Okay. Angela Penrose has asked a question. Will local people be able to afford these houses, or are they mainly for property investors? This links back, I think John Irwin raised the issue about affordability. How much affordable housing is there going to be in new development, and what does affordable actually mean? Jill or James?
Yeah, what does affordable actually mean? It's defined in the National Planning Policy Framework in the back, and it includes a whole load of different products. Housing for rent, starter homes, first homes, discounted market sales homes. And the level of affordable housing that we provide will need to be based on evidence. So we have that technical report already that was published in the summer of last year that set out what proportion of affordable housing we could justify asking for in policy terms. And across the borough, that's 30% according to that report. But we will update and refresh the report as we move forward. But we're bound by the definition of affordable housing in the NPPF.
And what is that definition in basic terms? Is it possible to put it in basic terms?
It's predominantly discounted market housing for rent or purchase, and securing truly affordable housing is, I think, becoming increasingly difficult, and seems to be more successfully delivered through different mechanisms where the house builder or developer are taking the lead. I should defer to James at this point, really, because sort of thinking more about at the coalface. But even within the definitions of affordable housing, certain percent of your affordable housing needs to be, for example, a first home, which is a discounted market product. It's designed to replace home ownership.
Okay, James, did you want to add anything there?
I think Jill's sort of covered it there. I think when you start looking at these aspects, the government have introduced the approach to affordable housing, which is almost based on a viability type assessment, which needs to be undertaken. And hence, we're probably able to achieve higher levels of affordable housing within the Faversham area than elsewhere within the borough, because you get, basically high value development taking place. And you saw the Reg 19, which was looking to increase affordable housing and looking to increase affordable housing across the borough as a whole. But then you got to balance that with infrastructure requirements as well, and balance that out with development. So it becomes quite a complex issue. And I think in the Reg 19, there was sort of evidence-based documents where we had viability consultants advising on that. And there's a balanced view to be taken on it. But I think generally we've been quite successful in securing affordable housing, whether it's the right type of affordable housing. A lot of people think we should be going for social housing particularly. That's not necessarily what we can secure. You're trying to get a balance of different types of development. I think is the right, John Owen mentioned the right type of development as well. So it's not affordable housing per se, but there's sort of sectors of housing, and elderly persons accommodation type thing is something I think we need to look at more. That's becoming more of a heightened need, and that's been found in the housing market assessments we've been doing. And we need to look at policies in which to promote elderly housing, assisted housing particularly. And indeed, in certain locations, that type of housing may be more appropriate where you do have traffic issues generally. So can we not promote development which has lower transport impacts? Assisted elderly housing may fall into that category, particularly in town centres where they want easy access to services and facilities as well. So I think it's something which the council's quite keen to look at in more detail to see whether it can bring policies to promote that type of development. And elderly housing tends to be smaller scale, flattered developments as well. You get high numbers being delivered in short time scales, so it helps with the 5-year supply and meeting our housing numbers as well at the same time.
Okay, thank you for that. The next question, Louise Lees has got a further question, which I think might have been a supplementary, follow-up to her previous question about the environment. She asked, can the council insist that all houses within the proposed developments are built to passive house standard? And I think passive house is a particular environmental standard. But I've checked online. I'll read it out so everyone is on the same page. Passive house is a voluntary standard for energy efficiency in a building, which reduces the building's ecological footprint. It results in ultra low energy buildings that require little energy, space heating or cooling. And there are some other similar ones mentioned. Could we go as far as passive house?
The answer to that is no, because there's it's not. We get developers who come forward with passive house standard developments because that's what they want to build, and that's generally considered by the planning committee and members to be a positive attribute towards a scheme. But as it stands at the moment, building control regulations go nowhere near passive house standard. As I said, we've tried to adopt looking at 50% reduction in carbon emissions, that type of approach. But again, that's, as I said, it's susceptible to appeal decisions because we don't have the policy backing to support that at the national level.
So the policy, I was going to ask you that just to clear, because people may hear you say the policy doesn't support that. And people may think, well, why doesn't Swales policy support that? But the point is it's central government policy that would need to change to enable that to be done. And if Swale just unilaterally said, we're going to demand passive house, developers would turn you over on appeal every time because of the central government framework. Okay, that's really helpful, I think, for people to know where the policy is being made. Mr. Maloney has asked a follow-up to his question. It was suggested Southern Water will provide infrastructure to facilitate allocations. Is this true in relation to the Ashford and Canterbury adopted plans? Well, I don't know if James and Jill can necessarily comment on the Ashford and Canterbury adopted plans, but perhaps on the key point of Mr. Maloney's question, it was suggested Southern Water will provide the infrastructure to facilitate allocations. So is there any more to add by way of detail on that? I mean, people are hearing about big developments. Let's take the Duchy proposed development. Will Southern Water have to provide infrastructure for the water and sewage that will come off that?
That's what they should be doing, yes. When you get to very large scale developments, particularly at the Duchy, I think even the Duchy will be providing some infrastructure to support Southern Water's needs as part of that development, because of the scale of the development itself, it just generates the need for that bit of kit to facilitate the needs of that development itself. Yeah, but there's a requirement on the water companies to facilitate that.
Okay. Is that though, who makes sure the water companies are doing enough? I mean, obviously water companies are unfortunately privatized. They want to spend less if they can help it to give their shareholders more profit, unfortunately. Who's got the big stick to make them do enough?
Basically government through Ofwat.
Okay, all right. Dolly White's got a question, and it's slightly different to some of the topics we've been talking about already, so I'm going to take this one. Is what is Swale's responsibility to link key documents of outside organisations to provide a joined up approach where residents become the focus rather than organisations doing the minimum in terms of communication? This links with the previous water comments. Not a resident, just an outside interloper. Well, you're very welcome to join us, Dolly. So I think Dolly's question, the heart of it is, what can Swale do? What is Swale doing to bring together documents of outside organisations to sort of, I think, empower residents to really involve themselves in this by finding the info they need?
Can you give us some examples, Dolly? I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, we've sometimes tonight referred to, I'll let Dolly come in. Dolly, do you want to come in? Just take your mute off mic if you want to. Yeah, go ahead.
Lovely. Sorry, I'm ill this evening. I hope you can understand me okay. So sorry about that. Basically, I've found out some really interesting information this evening, and every time I attend a meeting, more information comes out, which is fantastic. But what I'd like to know is, for instance, we've heard a lot this evening about the water document, and then, for instance, government being the accountability to the water companies. But actually, what local residents need I think, through these consultations is open access and more transparency to all the documents that would give them a bigger overall picture. And what I'd like to know from SWAL is if there's any movement in the future that we could aim towards that. So instead of it being a local plan that has loads of great detail in it from SWAL, that's brilliant, but we do have these glaring issues. So for instance, residents do have to wander off and do a lot of research themselves, and that is a barrier to accessibility to this process for them, if that makes sense. And I suppose I'm looking for a little chink of hope that we can do something about that for them, so everybody can find this process accessible.
Thanks for clarifying that. Absolutely agree. It's a horribly complex process, and when I'm the king, I'm going to make town planning be in the national curriculum, so kids are learning about it from an early age, and everybody sort of has a good strong understanding. It's a really tricky one, Dolly, because we don't have the responsibility for the production and promotion of these documents, and they're quite often things that we only become aware of through collaborative working with, for example, the CCG and so on. And a lot of these documents, they're really quite peripheral. So taking the example of the Southern Water 5-year business plan, yes, they're a statutory consultee. They're informed of what our intentions are with, as local plans progress and as development comes forward through the applications process. But it is absolutely, ultimately, 100% their responsibility to make sure that infrastructure is delivered. They're the statutory infrastructure providers, sort of in those terms. So the plan that we've been talking about tonight is not necessarily something that we would reference. And similarly, it's not something, the CCG plan isn't necessarily something that we would reference either. But it's a really nice point, and it's one I'd like to take away and think about.
Yeah, okay, that sounds a very constructive answer. Thanks, Jill. I'm going to take two questions that are quite similar together, or relate to each other. So Carol G asked a question: how many people (brackets family units) are there on the housing register in Swale awaiting a home or a suitably adapted home? And then Chris Williams, who's one of our town councillors, he asks, I think a partly related question: someone who rents in Faversham, I can barely afford to live here with with rentals being horrendously high. I can't afford a mortgage with the cost of new houses. I grew up here, work here, but feel like I'll be forced out of my hometown in the near future. We need new homes, but we need genuinely affordable homes. So particularly Chris's remarks are more of a comment, but very powerfully made, if I may say so. And Carol's question is: how many people are on the housing register waiting for housing in Swale?
Regarding Carol's question about the number of people on the council's housing register, I'm afraid it's not something I can answer. It's not information that I have access to. I would need to find out from housing colleagues and report back.
I wonder if there are some other councillors, some Swale councillors. Is there any of the councillors on the call might know the answer to that?
Hi, Anthony. I think I should be able to answer that one.
Good. I thought you might.
Just to clarify, Councillor Ben J. Martin, I'm Swale's Cabinet Member for Housing. So I'm going to start with the previous question on empty dwellings. There are 450 empty dwellings in Swale, give or take. Of those, about 50% are in probate, so we need the lawyers and whatnot to get their fingers out to get those back into use. And the remainder, those are long-term empties, which is anything over 6 months. And in terms of getting them back into use, we are encouraging, and the no-use empty scheme, for example, allows owners to bid for £25,000 of interest-free funding to do the works to get those houses back into use. But they wouldn't be anywhere near enough for meeting the target. And it's actually one of the lowest percentages of empty dwellings in Kent. In terms of the number of people on the affordable housing register, there are 1,200 approximately households on that register, 450 of which, 400-ish of which are currently in temporary accommodation. In terms of some of the affordable housing products, just for information, affordable rent is 80% of market value. First homes are discounted by 30% of market value and are only available to people purchasing their first home. And under the current NPPF, I believe they have to make up 10% of the overall affordable housing numbers. And then obviously you've got shared ownership and whatnot as well.
Okay, Ben, thanks very much for that. Angela asked a question about something that's quite different, a topic we haven't really had come up so far, is can Kent or Swale challenge the housing figures set by Westminster? Is this something that can be done? Has it been done before? Really, we've talked about these housing figures being pushed on us from Westminster. Can we challenge them, or are they just a fait accompli?
Absolutely, we can challenge them, but we need to have the evidence that supports our challenge. And unfortunately, we're just not in that position. So just by way of background, in the early part of 2020, we commissioned we commissioned a specialist report from a demographer to have a look at the information for Swale and to look and see if what was actually happening in terms of our population and household growth was in line with what the projections were, and there was no basically they were more or less, and there were no reasons that would justify an approach that would deviate from using the standard method. So it's something that you might see happen in areas with a high student population, for example.
That's interesting. Thanks very much. Claire Lampard has asked a number of questions, and I'm going to pick up one in particular. She asks about developers seem to reduce the percentage of affordable housing once they get planning permission, perhaps once they start building. This is something that I've heard about in the media. I don't know if it's happened locally. Is that something that's happened in and around Faversham, that afterwards they try and move the goalposts and reduce the amount of affordable housing?
I'm trying to remember. Faversham is quite an attractive area for housing developers, so they tend to be able to afford the affordable housing requirement that's set for them. We tend to have this issue more on the island, on Sheppey or in Sittingbourne, where viability levels are a bit more tight, and they would argue that they've got higher infrastructure costs in places as well. I'm just trying to remember if it's happened in Faversham. If it has, it would have been an extreme example where there would have been just something to do with the nature of the site, which incurred significant costs to the developer, that they may have had to reduce the affordable housing requirement. But I can't remember off the top of my head if there was a site in Faversham of that nature. So I think most of the sites are meeting their full affordable housing requirement as set under the adopted local plan policy. In
Sittingbourne and Sheppey, though, I mean, how do they get away with it? Because obviously you guys give them planning permission to build, I think you said 30% is the rule as well, 30% affordable housing. So why halfway through the job do they try and say, sorry Gov, we can't do it? I mean, you said viability, which I think means how much money they're going to make fundamentally, but they will do their maths, they'll get their accountants out before they start work. They know how many bricks they're going to need to buy, how many men they're going to need to hire to build houses. Why and how do they try this game on?
It's rare. They usually renegotiate at the planning application stage if they can't meet the policy requirement. I have to say, for the island, we got a 0% affordable housing policy at the moment. So developers don't need to provide affordable housing. Interestingly, the developments that do take place on the island do tend to include some affordable housing, because for cash flow reasons, having an affordable housing provider gives them the cash flow up front to get started on a site. So they see it as a positive attribute towards bringing forward affordable housing. And obviously there are grants out there through Homes England towards the provision of affordable housing, which can promote sites. So at Greenborough and Rushenden, for example, where we've really struggled to bring development forward as quickly as we want to, there are sites on there which are almost 100% affordable housing development sites, because it's the only investment they can find to bring forward the development that's required. Sittingbourne, our current policy is for 10% affordable housing. We are tending to secure that within the town. It gets a bit more difficult because we're looking at the higher levels on the outskirts of Sittingbourne, and that's where we tend to get some negotiation sometimes in terms of what comes forward. And then it becomes a balance between infrastructure provision and the affordable housing and the need to bring forward the housing. And it's a difficult balancing point for members to often have to consider when determining the planning application.
Interesting. So this affordable target varies across the borough. 0 in Sheppey, I think you said 10% Sittingbourne, 30% Faversham. Could we increase it above 30? Could we say we want 40% affordable housing?
Well, that's what we were proposing to do in the Reg 19.
Yeah.
So you saw enhanced affordable housing levels, but you've always got to have a viability assessment undertaken at the local plan level, which is now a requirement through the NPPF to set those levels. So you've got to balance that out with the other infrastructure needs which are required for the development. So there's always that balancing act.
And just to explain, because some folk on the call may be thinking, well, what does viability mean? Does it simply mean ensuring the developer can still make a certain amount of profit? Is it as mercenary as that?
It is, and it's based on the gross development value of the particular site. So, because you shouldn't be, if a company is really profitable, they shouldn't benefit or disbenefit from that process. So it's based on the gross development value of a site and achieving a 15 to 20% profit level. And we have our own consultant assessors when a developer comes along to challenge their ability to meet the affordable housing requirements. So we do double check on that with our own consultants to see that the information they're providing is correct.
Okay. All right. Carol G asks about a different topic. Does Swale have a CIL, community infrastructure levy? And her follow-up question is, if not, why?
We don't currently have a CIL. We do base our negotiations on Section 106 negotiations to secure development. As a borough, we tend to have a high proportion of large-scale developments, just because of the nature of the borough and the Thames Gateway area and whatever else. We secured quite large schemes, and they usually secure greater infrastructure requirements through Section 106 rather than through a CIL. Now, whether that balance has changed is a moot point, and we will be getting consultant advice again to advise the authority as we move forward with the local plan as to whether moving for CIL would be more advantageous in terms of getting hold of monies to secure infrastructure or not. So that will be happening. There's also an intent in the planning white paper to have a nationally set CIL, which may have some regional differences, but they're looking to set that nationally, and therefore that might be imposed again on the council to bring in a CIL should that be required. The big advantage with CIL is any development that takes place, you'll be securing funding towards infrastructure, even if it doesn't require planning permission over a certain level.
Okay, next one's a comment from Julian Speed, who we've not heard from before today, so that's why I've scrolled down to his comment. He says, a group of Linstead residents have just launched a website, really helpful in explaining what Reg 18 is all about and how to engage. It's obviously focused for the term Linstead area, but as more general comments might provide inspiration submissions from Faversham and surrounding communities. Thanks for that, Julian. Julian's put the web link there in the comments. It's stop-tao.org. So no doubt that will be helpful and interesting to people. Claire Lampard has asked a number of questions about water. She says in Cambridge they are pushing back, putting the brakes on housing development because of lack of water supply. And she also asks, says we need to be looking at new ways of harvesting rainwater, solar panels on homes, innovative solutions for rainwater going to combined sewers, which we know causes a lot of the floods. Tanner Street, Whitstable Road, combined sewers are a problem here in Faversham, and trees and permeable surfaces to catch rainwater. We have talked a bit about water already, but is there any more you can say? Can you potentially in the local plan, are you going to put rules in about water efficiency?
Yes, there will need to be policies in there that address water resources.
Okay, that's good. And any particular highlights, Jill, you want to mention? Or we'll wait and see. Okay, folks, it's 2 minutes past 9, and I did promise at the start that we would stop at 9 because this is Jill and James's working day, which no doubt I expect has been a very long working day. Lots of also you members of the public would have been at work today before coming to this meeting, but I think 2 hours have been really useful. I have certainly learned a lot of new information, which I'm grateful for, and a number of people have put in the chat that they've learned some new information. So it's been useful, it's been productive. We've had lots of really interesting questions and really interesting answers. Chris, I think you wanted to say something. Chris Barker.
Yeah, just like the previous Reg 19 we went through back in March, Jill and James, I'd really like to thank you for your contribution. I know it's difficult. You sit in the planning team and you're not responsible for the strategic options or where ultimately things are decided to go, that you are officers and you deliver on the wills of the councillors. So, and that these meetings can be quite difficult. It's at the end of your working day, and I'd just like to appreciate, thank you, and I really appreciate your time and effort. Thanks very much.
Yeah, let's call it a day. Let's call it a day there. John Owen said we'll publish the meeting recording, which would be good if anyone wants to refer back to it. Thanks ever so much, everyone. Nice to see you. Nice to meet you in relation to some new people. Take care.
Thank you.